Chapter 12, The Time with Josie. Half awake one morning, I heard the sound of a train. I looked up at the window to see a solid square of white, a storm with pin dots of flakes covering everything. What I had heard was the roar of the wind coming down the valley. I padded out of bed and went downstairs to see what was happening outside the big window. The holly bushes on one side of the house were just a blur. The narrow sliver of river and its snowy bank had disappeared in a mist of gray. A little cold, I hugged myself, watching that world. It was like a plastic globe in one of the houses I'd been in. When I shook it, snow fell, covering a bright green Christmas tree in its center. "Don't touch that, Hollis. Put it down." I rolled a huge piece of wood onto the banked fire, thinking I'd have to drag more in from the porch later. Henry looked up at me, meowing, waiting to go out. I reached for the knob, pulling, and when the door opened, a gust of wind blew a swirl of snow inside. Henry stared at me angrily. "Not my fault," I told him, pushing the door closed again. He went back to the couch, skinny tail twitching. "Sorry, cat." I ran my hand over the top of his head as I went into the kitchen to rummage through the cabinets. Ah, how far away the mustard woman was, locked in her house somewhere. How far away everyone was. I thought of the old man and Stephen and Izzy. They were just a few miles away, but those few miles were forever. Did Stephen like the snow, or were they so used to storms like this that they never paid attention to them? I wondered if they even thought about me the way I did about them. I wondered how Stephen was now. I could hear the old man's voice in my ears. I closed my eyes. Don't think of that. Don't ever think of that terrible afternoon again. I took out the box of cocoa with marshmallows and boiled a pot of water on the stove, thinking of what I'd do today. Draw in front of that big window, I told myself. Figure out a way to shade in that soft-planted trees, the gray ribbon of river. Charcoal would be wonderful for that. Maybe I'd even be able to use a chunk of burned wood from the fireplace. I'd done other pictures in the past few days and taped them around the living room. A snowshoe rabbit with tall ears, 4 deer nibbling at the bark of the evergreen, the bridge covered in clear ice. I'd done a few of Josie's in the snow, too. Almost nothing but a few quick lines. She walked every day down to the road around the evergreens, coming back with her scarf blowing around her face. What would happen if I left those pictures when we had to leave next spring? What would the old man say when he found them? What would Izzy say? And Stephen? Spring. Could I call Beatrice then? She would have had months. What would happen to me? Who cared? I'd think of something, but I'd never leave the pictures. I'd take them with me in my backpack. Sitting at the table waiting for the cocoa to cool, I thought about Christmas. I'd lost track of the days. I flipped Izzy's wall calendar ahead to December, trying to figure it out. How long had we been here? 8 days? 9? I counted back. The water was ready. I mixed the cocoa and took a sip, feeling the heat of it, the steam on my upper lip. Today could be Christmas Eve. I stood there planning. When the snow stopped, I'd get myself out and take some of the evergreen branches. There were so many trees we could fill rooms with them. We'd trim the mantel with great heaps of green and tuck Josie's ornaments in among the needles. Maybe we'd find a few pine cones, too. We'd have a special dinner tomorrow night. Fruit cocktail and canned tuna. A feast. And popcorn. I wished I had a present for Josie. The only thing I could give her was a picture of herself. But the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea. I'd do that today instead of drawing trees. I took another sip of cocoa. What about Josie with Beatrice at the movies in front of their popcorn machine? Both of them would be eating, mouths full, arm in arm, smiling. "Sleigh bells ring," Josie sang, coming into the kitchen behind me. I was just thinking that. I reached for another cup and poured in water for Coco. She stopped to peer out the window. I've watched the snow in the ocean. It melts as it hits the water. She touched the glass with all 5 fingers. There is nothing like the ocean. I tried to think of something to change the look in her eyes. I was thinking we'd have a party, I told her, with your ornaments and tree branches from outside. She smiled, looking up at the ceiling. "We could listen to carols on the radio," she said. "That's what Beatrice and I do every year. That and talk about when we were young. Where is Beatrice?" "Painting," I said. It's warm where she is." Josie shook her head. "We always make almond cookies. We eat half and sell the other half at the movie. It would be nice if we had a radio." I popped 2 of our last pieces of bread in the toaster. "And too bad we don't have a few eggs around." "Or almond syrup," she said. "Or butter," I said, and we both laughed. "We'd have to ask Santa Claus," she said. "He'd bring it all to us on his—" She paused, thinking. "Sleigh." She shook her head. "That was 100 years ago. Now he comes on a—" She looked up at the ceiling. I laughed. "A motorbike?" "One of those snow things." She nodded, laughing too. "But how could we not have a radio? Everyone has a radio." I finished off my cocoa, one sweet marshmallow left in my mouth, trying to remember. Had there been a radio here? There was never a television, I remember that. But Josie was right, there must be a radio. I wandered around searching and finally found one on a shelf behind boxes of old jigsaw puzzles, the old cord wrapped around it. All that time Henry was stalking me, a line between his eyes as if he were frowning. He really wanted to go out. I went through the door again and opened it a crack. The snow was worse now, much worse. The line of trees had disappeared and even the shed seemed far away. I was almost afraid to let Henry out. Before I could shut the door again, though, he darted around me and was gone. I stood there shivering, trying to see where he was, and then he was back, streaking through the door straight across the living room, into the kitchen, and onto Josie's lap. I set up my drawing things in front of the window, beginning the rough lines that would turn into Josie. Josie was there on the other side of the room at the table, fiddling with the knob on the radio until she found a station with Christmas music. The announcer's voice, "A lovely Christmas Eve morning." I'd hit the date straight on the head. The songs began one after another. Adeste Fideles, Silent Night, Winter Wonderland, and one I'd never heard of before, Gather Round the Christmas Tree. I leaned the paper in front of me so Josie wouldn't see what I was doing. I sketched in the space around Beatrice first, the counter, the popcorn machine, and then began to work on the faces. Every few minutes I'd peer out at the snow coming down. Across the river, the mountain was blurred, just a dark shadow rising in the pewter sky. And then I thought about Josie sitting there, my figure in her hand, staring out the window too as she listened to the music, her face tilted, her eyes sad. 11th picture. On the mountain. I never really drew any of this. I tried not to think about it. It kept coming up inside my head, though, picture after picture of what happened that last day, Saturday. Izzy and the old man off on some antique hunt all the way up to Masonville. Stephen begging me to go fishing. "We'll take the boat all the way to the rapids," he said. "Bring our lunch." "You go," I said, barely looking up from my drawing. "Gonna spend this whole day with a bunch of pencils in your mouth, fooling around with bits of paper?" I grinned at him over my shoulder. "Go, Stephen," I thought. "Get out of here." And then he went with great clatter, pail and oars, pole and lures, a sandwich dripping tomatoes out the side. "You'll probably be sorry in 2 minutes." He sounded sorry. "Do you mind?" I asked. He grinned. "Not really, but I'll be gone all day, I warn you." He climbed into the rowboat, and I watched him, his back bent, leaning over the oars until he was gone. I put everything away carefully, my pad and pencils, cleaned up the tomato mess in the kitchen, put away the box of Malamars, shut the refrigerator door, and all the time I was thinking, 3 hours up, 3 hours back, a cinch. I grabbed a sweater just in case. It was getting cold now, and at the last minute I changed my mind and took a few pieces of paper folded in my pocket, a few pencils, green, gray, brown, and black, and the French blue one. Who knew what I could use it for, but it was my favorite. And then I began to climb. It was hot work. I draped the sweater over a tree limb. After a while I could feel the pull in my ankles, the rub of my sneakers against my heels. I stopped at the halfway point to look down at the house, the snake of the river, and I could see Stephen, a tiny figure in the rowboat. I pulled out some paper, made a quick sketch, and climbed some more mud. The old man was right. It was deceptive. I couldn't tell it was there until I stepped in it, once covering the whole of my sneaker. I pulled the shoe out and wiped it with a few leaves. I was out of breath by the time I reached the top and hungry. Why hadn't I made my own tomato sandwich? There was water, though, a tiny thread of it trickling down from one of the rocks, and I leaned my face into it and drank and put my wrists under it and then took the last few steps, and I was there. It opened out, a wide piece of rock, and I danced out onto it, catching my breath. I brought the dark pencils, but this was a light world. I could see toy houses in the river and even the town of Hancock in the distance. There was a tiny silver lake and a road with miniature cars. "It's Christmas," I shouted. I said all the things I wanted to. "I'm new," I said. "I'm different." And in my head I told myself I'd never be mean again. I'd be friendly. I'd go to school and I'd walk up to people. "A new leaf," I said. I said twirling, dizzy, hungry, and the bubbles inside twirled with me until I took one step too close to the edge in that muddy sneaker. And then I was rolling, feeling the sharp edge of a branch tearing into my arm and a stone gashing into my forehead, and finally I was stopped by a huge boulder a few feet down. The wind had been knocked out of me. I lay gasping. I pulled myself back up. Not so bad, not so terrible, I told myself, wiping the blood out of my eye, except that I knew I'd never be able to walk all the way down by myself. I didn't begin to call Stephen until much later, until the sun had crossed toward the west and I knew it was late afternoon and I didn't want to try Izzy and the old man. I didn't want Izzy and the old man to know I had done such a stupid thing. And even as I called, I knew Stephen couldn't hear me. But he came. Of course he came. Just before sunset I heard him, or rather I heard the pickup truck, gears grinding and then stopping, the door slamming, and then he was standing over me. I knew it, he said. How? He narrowed his eyes. Break any bones? Certainly not. I wasted my whole afternoon, he said. Felt sorry that you were all alone, came back and... Wasted? Right. I figured it out, though. You weren't anywhere. So why'd you bring the truck? I asked. Think I had 3 hours before dark to walk all the way up here to get you? He shook his head. I thought you'd been killed. Just wounded, I said, laughing. We sat at the edge of the rock watching the sun go down. Stephen pointed. Our winter place is somewhere over there. You'll see it soon. To the east, far below, was the summer house, the holly bushes, a blur of green, the golden field, and the thread of river. It took my breath away. I want to show you something, I told Stephen. I reached into my pocket for the crumpled up W picture I had taken out of my backpack before I'd left. I've had it since I was 6. We sat on a ledge, our feet dangling, and he smoothed the picture on his knee, stared at it, and then looked over at me. We had to find pictures with W words, I said. It's a wishing picture, he said slowly, for a family. I could feel my lips trembling. Oh, Mrs. Evans, I thought, why didn't you see that? It's too bad you didn't come when you were 6. He smiled. I knew you had to stay with us when you let me win that checkers game. His hair was falling over his forehead, and his glasses were crooked, almost hiding his eyes. I thought of the X picture day and walking out of school. I thought of sitting in the park on a swing, my foot digging into the dirt underneath. I run away sometimes, I said. I don't go to school. He kicked his foot gently against the ledge, his socks down over his sneakers. Someone called me incorrigible. Now that I'd begun, I didn't know how to stop. Kids never wanted to play with me. I was mean. Stephen pulled his glasses off and set them down on the ledge next to him. He rubbed the deep red mark in the bridge of his nose. I stopped, looking out as far as I could, miles of looking out. For a moment I was sorry, I told him. But he turned and I could see his eyes clearly, and I wondered if he might be blinking back tears. I wasn't sure, though. He reached out and took my hand. You ran in the right direction this time, didn't you? And that was it. He knew all about me, and he didn't mind. We have to go down now, he said, before they come back and find out. I nodded. I stood up, and I could feel the pain shoot through my ankle. I limped to the pickup truck. I'm glad you came, I said. I could never have walked all the way down. It was a dumb thing to do, he said. Coming up here, Pop would have had a fit. And so we went down. Stephen was a sure and careful driver, but it was so steep, and the truck kept going, kept sliding, even with the brake pressed down as hard as he could manage. He pressed and he pressed, but the truck gained speed, and just before the end, when we would have been all right, when we would have been all fine, the truck tipped, and I could see we were going to go over. And Stephen yelled at me, Jump, Holly! Chapter 13, The Time with Josie. Late that afternoon, the snow tapered off and stopped. I took a last look at the picture, pleased with it. Beatrice listening to something Josie sang, both of them with bags of popcorn in their hands. I sneaked it into my room so that Josie wouldn't see it. I put on all the clothes I could find and Izzy's boots and went outside to sink into the snow, almost to my knees. The cold was shocking. It stung the inside of my nose and numbed my cheeks. Everything was still. The birds must have found nesting places for the night, and the deer were hiding somewhere deep in the woods. The last slim line of river had frozen. If I hadn't known it was there, I'd have walked right across the other side. I wondered if the ice would carry my weight yet. I realized I wouldn't be able to pick up evergreen or holly branches from the ground. Everything the wind had brought down was under the snow. I'd have to saw off what I could. Josie and Henry were framed in the window waving to me. I reached down to scoop a handful of white and tossed it at them. Then I trudged over to the shed, for the old man saw and found Stephen's sweater hanging on the knob, encrusted with snow. I didn't even remember leaving it there. I folded it, put it on one of the shelves, reached for the saw, and spent the last bit of daylight hacking away at branches, making sure not to spoil the shapes of the trees. The wind wasn't as strong under the shelter of those trees, and it reminded me of something the old man had told me. Hunters who were lost would pull the branches together with rope, bending them to form a shelter. I loved the thought of that, the trees forming a cozy nest, and then I shivered thinking of being alone. You have Josie, Stephen might have said. I love Josie, I said back. From inside, music spilled from the radio. All I want for Christmas, what I want, what I want. Josie was turning on the lamps now. The house was like a Christmas card with the lights shining on the snow. I stood there watching, wondering how far the light might be seen. I reached up for the last branch, snow spraying my face. No one could see the light anyway, I told myself. It faced the river, away from the road, and no one would be on the old man's mountain toward evening after a storm like this. You're a snowman, Josie said as I trudged onto the porch, staggering under bulky branches. I pulled off Izzy's waders and rubbed my feet until the feeling came back. Josie danced around me. I have something for you for your dinner, she said, delighted with herself. I was saving it for a surprise. She led me into the kitchen and opened the cabinet over the refrigerator. I thought I knew where everything was, but in back of Izzy's old bowls and mixers was a row of treasures, a box of dried milk, pancake mix, and a jar of applesauce. Yes, Josie said with satisfaction. We'll have apple pancakes for dinner with cold milk. My mouth watered. A Christmas Eve dinner. I'll pay you back, Izzy, every cent if it takes me the rest of my life. So Josie cooked for the first time, talking to me over her shoulder about Beatrice. Ornaments sparkle on the tree, and Beatrice lights the candles. Every time Josie talked about Beatrice, she seemed to come alive, I thought. Beatrice in her house. I knew she was homesick. We'll have Christmas here, too, I told her. I'll set up everything after we eat. But after I'd finished the pancakes covered with dollops of sweet applesauce, my eyes drooped. I was warm and sleepy. Let's do it all in the morning, I said. Presents, Josie said, a secret smile lighting her face. I curled up in bed, looking out the window at a pale moon and trees thick with snow, thinking I'd never seen anything so beautiful. I could see movement at the edge of the trees and sat up to see what it was. And then suddenly a fox, silvery gray with his tail streaming out in back of him, darted across that open space, crossed the ice, and was gone. I saw a fox, Stephen. I've never seen a fox before. I lay back trying to figure out what Josie might have for me. Maybe she'd found another package of food. I fell asleep wondering what it was, what I'd like it to be. Something sweet, something chocolate or salty, potato chips. Next morning the sun was blinding, and the shed glittered like the witch's house and Hansel and Gretel. I lay there, something on the edge of my mind. What was it? Something about the shed? Or was I wondering what the old man would think if he knew I was spending Christmas in his house? I didn't want to think about that, but there was something else. Was it Josie's present for me? An egg was what I really wanted this morning. What I could do with an egg. I'd bake a cake or cookies. I'd whip it up for an eggnog. I'd fry it like a little sun in a pan. I threw on my clothes. The house still smelled of the pancakes from last night. I went into the kitchen. At that moment, the back door opened and Josie came in, her scarf pulled over her forehead, her nose red. I wanted to tell her she shouldn't be out there, that it was too cold, the snow too deep, but I'd sound like the stucco woman. I turned back to the stove. Cocoa with milk, I said. We hurried through breakfast, and afterward I went out on the porch to shake the snow off the branches before I brought them inside. I covered the mantelpiece, the sharp pine smelling like Christmas, as Josie unwrapped the box of ornaments. Here's my old Santa Claus. I could hear the tears in her voice as she hung him in the center. And this one. She held up a thick pink plastic globe. Ugly, isn't it? It's the only kind we could get during the Second World War. She went on telling me the history of each one until the mantel was finished and the center of the table held a bowl of holly. We'll even hang a few of those glittery ornaments over the window to catch the light, I said, aloud to myself. Please be happy, Josie. Presents now? Josie asked. Maybe, I said absently. I had caught movement outside as I hung the glass-clear prism. We watched as 7 or 8 deer wandered in front of the house, making their way toward the evergreens. Suddenly something disturbed them. Heads back, noses up, they stood shock still for an instant, then scattered, two to bound across the river ice as the fox had last night, the others in the opposite direction toward the bridge. I tried to see what had bothered them. I looked toward the evergreens myself, looked back as far as I could. There was no light anywhere, nothing to make me think about a fisherman being out there somewhere. I had a quick thought of the night on the mountain with the flashlights like glowworms above me. It was then I remembered. Stephen's sweater, a flash of green in the snow as I backed away from the fisherman that day. I hadn't left it in the doorknob on the shed. I opened my mouth to ask Josie if she had picked it up when she'd been outside, but Josie would never remember. Maybe I didn't want to know the answer anyway, thinking of the fishermen finding us and what might happen then.